All right, so we're now on Abnormal Psychology Lecture Series, Part 4, Section B, and we will talk about anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, and trauma related disorders. And these are some of the most common, all right, and most relatable disorders for students, partly because everyone knows what stress, fear, worry, or unwanted thoughts feel like. The challenge is learning where normal experience ends and where clinically significant disorder begins. This section matters because these orders often hide behind phrases that sound ordinary. I'm just a worrier, or perhaps I'm just careful, I'm just overthinking, I'm just stressed. But sometimes those patterns become so intense, so persistent, and so disruptive that they start controlling the person's life. So, as we go through this cluster, keep one big idea in mind: fear, worry, intrusive thoughts, and stress reactions are normal human experiences. But when they become excessive, rigid, and impairing, they can become psychopathology. So now let's begin with anxiety disorders. The core issue here is not just fear or worry by itself. The key issue is excessive fear, chronic worry, avoidance, and impairment. Because everyone gets anxious. Students, for example, get anxious before presentations or examinations or interview and entrance interview, thesis defenses, and opening their grades in a portal. That is normal. Anxiety becomes clinically important when it is too intense, too frequent, too hard to control, and too disruptive. And a big pattern in anxiety disorders is this: the person starts trying to feel safe by avoiding discomfort. But that avoidance gives short term relief and long term restriction. So, the person feels better for a moment, but their world gets smaller, and that is one of the reasons anxiety disorders can become so powerful. It is important also to distinguish fear from anxiety. Fear usually is a response to an immediate threat. Something is happening now. Your body gears up fast. It is present focused. So maybe a dog suddenly lunges at you, or you almost get hit by a motorcycle while you're crossing the street. So those are fear. It's normal to feel fear in those scenarios. Anxiety, on the other hand, is more future oriented. It is the mind anticipating danger before it happens. So the thinking could be, what if I embarrass myself tomorrow? What if I fail? What if something bad happens and I cannot handle it? That distinction matters clinically because fear is often tied to immediate triggers, while anxiety is often tied to anticipation, uncertainty, and imagined future danger. One feels like alarm and the other feels like dread. And for many students, anxiety is not just one thought, it is a whole internal playlist of worst case scenarios that keeps replaying even when nothing is happening yet. I know because I was once in college too. So, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD, is basically worry that refuses to stay in one lane. It spreads across multiple areas of life: school, health, family, money, relationships, the future, your teacher, okay, your blockmate, and sometimes even things that have not happened and may never happen. The hallmark here is uncontrollable worry, not just frequent worrying, but difficulty turning it off. The person may know they are overthinking, but insight does not automatically stop the process. So, GAD or GAD also tends to come with a physical cost. So, there's muscle tension, restlessness, sleep problems, fatigue, irritability, and trouble concentrating. So, This is not just I think too much. It is more like the nervous system is always on standby. A relatable example would be a student who cannot enjoy a free evening because their mind is already worrying about next week or next semester, their future career, their parents' expectations, right? Or the students' expectations if you are a student leader, and whether that one message I sent, okay, or you sent sounded wrong. So that is not just being responsible, that may be chronic anxiety at work. And now let's go to panic disorder, which centers on panic attacks. And just as importantly, the fear of future attacks. A panic attack is a sudden surge of intense fear or discomfort that rises quickly, often within minutes, and can include symptoms like pounding heart, shortness of breath, dizziness, chest tightness, trembling, nausea, or the feeling that something terrible is about to happen. I know because it happened to me back in college and even when I was already working. And what makes panic disorder especially frightening is that the body can feel like it is having a medical emergency. Many people think I'm dying, you know. That was what happened to me before. Or perhaps I'm going crazy or I'm about to lose control. And then another problem appears. The person starts becoming afraid of the panic itself. They scan their body more, notice every sensation. I remember just noticing or hearing my heartbeat. I'm already catastrophizing normal changes in my body, you know, and become trapped in what we call the panic cycle. So the important point here is this: in panic disorder, the person is not only afraid of danger outside, they start becoming afraid of their own body. So that is panic disorder. Next, let's go to agoraphobia. It is often misunderstood as simply fear of open spaces, but that is too narrow. The deeper issue is fear of being in situations where escape might be difficult or help might not be available if panic or intense distress happens. This is why people with agoraphobia may avoid public transport, crowded places, long lines, malls, theaters, bridges, or even leaving home alone. Because the question in their mind is often, what if something happens and I cannot get out? So over time, this creates a shrinking world. The person starts building a safe zone, but the safe zone keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. First, they avoid one place, then another place, then another, and then eventually, even ordinary movement becomes so difficult for them. A student version of this might be someone who starts avoiding long commutes, crowded classrooms, or campus events because they are terrified of having a panic episode where they cannot leave easily. That is not laziness, that is fear becoming geography. So that is agoraphobia. Now let's talk about specific phobia, which involves intense fear tied to a specific object or situation. For example, heights, acrophobia, right? Injections, okay, if you have fear of needles, dogs, okay, blood, or fear of flying, all right? Again, the fear has to be intense, okay, or enclosed spaces. The fear, again, is excessive relative to the actual danger. But the person often knows that and still cannot stop the reaction. So even if they know that they might not be in danger, that there is no actual danger, they still cannot stop their reaction. And that is the important point here. Insight does not automatically cancel fear. A person can fully understand that an elevator is safe and still feel overwhelming panic when stepping into one. Exposure to the feared object or situation usually triggers immediate distress or immediate avoidance. So, if someone has a severe needle phobia, for example, even the idea of a blood test can be enough to make their body react. That is why phobias are not just preferences. I don't like snakes is not the same as I will reorganize my life to avoid even seeing a picture of one. And yes, sometimes people with phobia can get scared with the sight of a photo, all right, of what they are have phobia of. So that is specific phobia. Let's go to the next one. Social anxiety disorder. Again, social anxiety disorder is not just shyness. The core issue is an intense fear of negative evaluation, being judged, embarrassed, humiliated, rejected, or exposed as inadequate. So the person often experiences social situations as performances under a microscope: public speaking, meeting new people, reciting in class, eating in public, asking a question, even sending a message in a group chat can feel loaded with threat. And one important feature here is safety behaviors. These are behaviors meant to prevent embarrassment. So what happens is over-rehearsing, all right? There's avoiding of eye contact, speaking softly, staying quiet, perhaps sitting at the back, okay, of the class, okay, checking every sentence before sending it. Okay, ironically, these behaviors reduce anxiety short term but maintain it long term. So a very college student example is someone who knows the answer in class but stays silent because the fear of sounding stupid feels worse than the value of participating. That is not just introversion. Sometimes that is social anxiety running the show. Okay, so that's social anxiety disorder. And now we move to obsessive compulsive disorders. OCD is often trivialized in everyday language. People say, I'm so OCD, when they mean neat, organized, or particular. Clinically, that is not enough. At the core of OCD are obsessions and again, compulsions. Obsessive compulsive, right? Obsessions are intrusive, unwanted thoughts, urges, or images that create distress. Compulsions are repetitive behaviors or mental acts the person feels driven to perform to reduce that stress or prevent something bad from happening. So OCD is not mainly about liking order. It is about getting trapped in a cycle where the mind generates distress and the person tries to neutralize it through ritualized behavior. For example, someone might repeatedly check clocks, wash hands, count, pray, repeat phrases silently, or seek reassurance, not because they enjoy it, but because their anxiety demands it. That is very different from being tidy or detail oriented. Right? So that is obsessive compulsive disorder. And now let's move to the obsessions and compulsions. Let's break that cycle down more clearly. Obsessions are intrusive thoughts, urges, or images that feel unwanted and distressing. They can involve contamination, harming oneself, harming others, morality, symmetry, blasphemy. Okay, could be sex or fear of making a mistake. Compulsions are the person's attempt to manage that distress. These can be visible behaviors like washing, checking, arranging, repeating, or mental acts like counting, okay, praying, mentally reviewing, or silently undoing a thought. The trap is that compulsions often work in the short term. They bring relief, but that relief teaches the brain, good, keep doing this. And so the cycle strengthens. That is why OCD can become so consuming. It is not irrationality in the simple sense. It is a learning loop powered by fear and temporary relief. The behavior makes sense emotionally even when it becomes clinically destructive. And so that is a difference between obsession and compulsion. So now we shift into trauma and stressor related disorders. These disorders rather, are organized around exposure to a traumatic or highly stressful event and the way the mind and body respond afterward. Trauma exposure can involve actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence, or other overwhelming events. Some people experience it directly, others witness it. Some learn about it happening to someone close. The key point is that the event overwhelms the person's ability to process, cope, or feel safe. The symptom pattern often includes intrusive memories, there's avoidance, hyperarousal, emotional changes, and functional disruption. In other words, the event may be over, but the nervous system acts like the danger is not finished. And this section matters because trauma does not just affect memory. It can affect safety, trust, concentration, sleep, emotional regulation, relationships, and identity. So, trauma and stressor related disorders are a very interesting component, all right, that we will study in terms of abnormal psychology. And now we move to post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. It is usually taught through four major symptom clusters. First, re-experiencing. Okay, this is where intrusive memories, flashbacks, nightmares, or intense distress, okay, is re-experienced when reminded of the trauma. Second, avoidance. Avoiding thoughts, feelings, people, places, or situations linked to the trauma. Third, we have negative changes in mood and cognition. There's emotional numbness, detachment, guilt, shame, memory gaps, or negative beliefs like I am not safe or the world is dangerous. Alright, so again, that's third, negative changes in mood and cognition. And then fourth, we have hyperarousal, being jumpy, on edge, easily startled, irritable, unable to sleep, or unable to relax. A student example might be someone who went through a violent or highly distressing event and now cannot pass a certain place, cannot sleep well, is constantly scanning for danger, and feels like their body is always braced. PTSD is not just remembering something bad. It is the trauma continuing to live in the nervous system. Okay, so that is PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Now let's have adjustment disorder and stress responses. Adjustment disorder sits close to normal stress, which is why context matters so much here. This disorder involves emotional or behavioral symptoms that develop in response to an identifiable stressor, usually within a relatively short time after it begins. The issue is not that the stressor exists. The issue is that the reaction becomes out of proportion or leads to meaningful impairment in functioning. So, for example, a student may go through a breakup, fail a major subject, transfer schools, lose financial support, or struggle with family conflict. Stress is expected, but if the reaction becomes intense enough that the person cannot function, cannot cope, and starts deteriorating, then we may be looking at more than ordinary stress. Again, we may be looking at more than ordinary stress. So the key distinction is not stress versus no stress. The key distinction is normal stress response versus clinically significant disruption. Okay, so that's adjustment disorder and stress responses. So far in section B, we have looked at fear, worry, panic, compulsions, trauma, and stress reactions. A common thread across all of them is that the mind and body are reacting to danger, threat, uncertainty, or distress in ways that become excessive and impairing. So when we move into section C, we will talk about dissociative and somatic symptoms disorder. And this next section shifts the focus slightly. So instead of fear and worry being the most obvious features, we start looking at what happens when distress shows up as disconnection from memory, identity, consciousness, or as intense preoccupation with physical symptoms. In other words, the next question is not just what if something bad happens? It becomes what happens when the mind disconnects or when distress gets expressed through the body in a way that becomes deeply disruptive. That is where we go next. So, thank you so much for listening. Okay, we'll talk about dissociative and somatic symptoms disorders when I upload the lecture pretty soon. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Till next time.